It almost goes without saying, but I'll say it I'll say it anyway because it's important. Journalists are under attack, and they are increasingly facing threats online, as evidenced by several recent surveys that revealed high levels of harassment and violence against reporters nationwide, both physically and digitally. With the prevalence of anti-press rhetoric and an intense political environment, journalists have been sharing with us at the National Press Club Journalism Institute that they've received an increase in threats in the days leading up to and since the November election. With that in mind, we've asked three professionals who think about this topic often, not to cover every aspect of digital safety. I don't think we have time for that today, but to give you some practical tools to protect yourself online in 2025. We are recording this program, so if you miss something, please don't worry. You'll have a chance to catch it a second time. And as usual with our programs, highlights will appear on our website as well as in our newsletter with the video recording. So if you aren't already receiving the Institute's daily newsletter, the latest, it's for journalists, it's free, and you can subscribe now. And we also have a monthly newsletter. So great ways to stay in touch with what's happening to journalists and for journalists. And it's now my honor to introduce our accomplished panelists. Please welcome our esteemed experts. We have Todd Bellamy Walker, who is the program manager of digital safety training and resources media at PEN America. They've worked in several newsrooms, including the Seattle Times and NBC News's diversity verticals. Todd is also the program co-director of the Trans Journalist Association's Peer Career Network, the organization's inaugural mentoring program. Thank you, Todd, for
Thank
joining.
you. Thank you.
We also are joined by Maria Salazar Ferro, who is the Director of Newsroom Safety and Resilience at the New York Times, where she supports journalists covering the United States to work safely in physical, digital, and psychological spaces. Maria joined the Times in 2021 after 16 years at the Committee to Protect Journalists. In 2016, Maria launched the CPJ Emergencies Department, helping journalists in distress in countless crises around the world. Thanks for joining us, Maria.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And we have Greg Lipper, who is the founder of Lipper Law PLLC here in Washington. He has extensive experience in criminal defense, including the defense of protesters, as well as First Amendment and media law. Now in his 20th year as a practicing attorney, Greg litigates both trials and appeals and was named one of Washington, D.C.'s best criminal defense lawyers by Washingtonian Magazine in 2020. Thank you, Greg, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I used to fact check that Washingtonian list, so I can validate that that's worthwhile being on. So I'm going to jump right in. I want us to start off by making sure we're all aware of the same language and terminology. It's impossible to tackle an issue if you can't name or define it. So Todd, I'm going to start with you. I'd love for you to define some of the main tactics online abusers are using to intimidate journalists or otherwise hinder their work. And I'm going to go ahead and share some of the slides you shared with me.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we jump into the tactics of online abuse, I'd love for us to have a shared language around what online abuse is. So we define online abuse as the repeated or severe targeting of an individual or group online through harmful behaviors. And we use the words repeated to point to the volume or the amount of abuse you are receiving. For example, someone flooding your cell phone or your email with so much spam that you can't use it anymore. And then we use the word severe to show that this can be just one incident that can have very serious consequences. For example, if you have been doxxed and someone posts your home address and threatens you, right? So now that we have a shared understanding of what online abuse is, I'd like to hop into some of the tactics, right? So we have hateful speech. That is any speech that targets someone's identity. For example, their race, their ethnicity, or their gender. For example, in my experience on the communities beat at the Seattle Times, I experienced a great deal of hate speech that targeted me not only for being Black, but also for being a trans man. And then we also have threats, right? So we have threats of physical or sexual violence. So that, of course, is intended to instill fear and intimidate a target. And we have seen that women, non-binary, and transgender people face more threats of sexual violence. Next, we have cyber mobs. So cyber mobs are a coordinated attack by a group of abusers with the goal of overwhelming the target with a lot of threats, slurs, or insults. And finally, we have doxing. So doxing is the publishing of personal private information. So that, includes, your kid's daycare, your home address, or your cell phone number. And there are several other tactics that we can also, get into, like online impersonation. So that's when someone makes a fake account to post inflammatory remarks about you or your institution. And then we also have non-consensual intimate images. So this is known more commonly as revenge porn, but this is not porn because these are private or manufactured sexually explicit images that are being shared without the target's consent. I feel like it's just really important that we have a shared understanding of some of the tactics so you can know how to respond and who to reach out to for support.
Thank you so much, Todd. That's a great way to start. So we're all aware of the same terminology. And I know it's very easy. I know I've confused some of the terminology myself before. So thank you for starting us with that. Maria, I'd love to turn to you. At an organization as large and influential as the New York Times, can you describe how you think about digital threats and online harassment, not just online, but how it impacts other aspects of just being a human being?
Thanks, Elliot. You kind of gave me a heads up in my introduction when you described the extent of the portfolio I oversee, but essentially the way we like to think about newsroom safety here, or the way we do think about it and actually operationalize it, is we think of it as a three-legged stool. And apologies, I meant to send you the image, but you can all imagine a very nice three-legged stool in which you can be sitting. And the idea of the stool is that a journalist can be sitting on it and focusing on their work, on the reporting, on their photography, whatever they're doing, knowing that they're safe. But the stool can only be safe if all three legs are properly screwed in, so it can't wobble. And here is where the metaphor ends, or where I really will begin to flesh it out. One of the legs is traditional physical safety, which is the way we always think about it. You're going to cover a protest, you need a helmet and a flak jacket. The second leg will be digital or online safety. And this will be, and I want to emphasize online because it's the space that you're in. You're in a physical space, you're in an online space. So how do you enter the space safely to do your work and be able to continue to live in the space without being targeted? So there's definitely some digital security work that's being done there, securing your equipment, securing your passwords, but it's also securing your personal information, much to Todd's point before, and how you can become vulnerable by having that personal information weaponized against you. So we work on that too, and we can definitely go a little bit deeper if you want to, Elliot. And then the third leg of our stool will be psychological safety. And this is really important when we're talking about the online world, because the number of times that we have seen online violence actually spill into the physical world is very small. And certainly doxing, as Todd was saying, is one of those where you can really veer into a physical world. But we want our journalists to understand that a lot of that online violence that is happening is mostly targeting your head. It's trying to get into your head to make you question who you are, to make you question the work that you're doing, and ultimately to succeed in silencing you. So that's where the psychological work comes in. And very much the same way that we started talking about PPE to go out and cover a protest, so personal protective equipment, we want that to be in the psychological world. So how can you enter a space where you can be targeted with your own identity and be able to do your work and to continue to live in that space? So Now to take you back to the original question, we work with these three legs at the same time. So each story, each journalist will get a little bit of that support to be able to do their work and to focus on their work.
That's really helpful, Maria. And I want to go a bit deeper on that in just a minute. But first, Greg, how can journalists recognize, we're talking about terminology here. How can journalists recognize the line between free speech and hate speech? Is there certain legal terminology folks should be aware of?
Yes, and I'm going to pick up on Maria's three-legged stool and add a four-legged chair. And so we'll have a full, living room set by the end of this. But leg number one, I think it is important to take a step back, both for yourself, but also, depending within your newsroom, or if you're dealing with other actors in the system like law enforcement. That number one is that the internet is not a law-free zone, that there are long-standing laws on the books in all 50 states and the District of Columbia and under federal law prohibiting things like threats, for instance. And those laws apply legally fully to the internet. And it is worth keeping in mind. I think a lot of people, I think the cyber kind of takes many people to a different region of their brain, and that is appropriate in many respects. But I think it may be useful just to start, just like lop the cyber part off and think about it. If this happened to me at a meeting, or if I was, if I was in the library and someone came up to me and said the following thing to me, what would I think about it, and how would I react, and how would I expect other people to react? Just yesterday, a woman was charged with threats and was being held, detained on $100,000 bail for when she was on the phone with her insurance company, said, "Delay, deny, depose, you people are next." And there was a lot of sort of shock and outrage on the internet about that. And I am, no fan of health insurance companies myself, but as a legal matter, I was like, yeah, of course you're going to get charged with threats if you do something like that, say something like that. And that as a legal matter doesn't really change on the internet. Now, the second leg, however, is that the line sometimes, as Elliot alluded to in his question, is sometimes threats are clear and other times they're not. The threat, there is a doctrine, a longstanding Supreme Court doctrine called the True Threats Doctrine, which basically says a threat of physical violence is not protected by the First Amendment. There's been a lot of back and forth in a few cases over exactly how you define that, what level of knowledge or intent the threat maker needs to have. But at a very basic level, a threat of violence is not protected by the First Amendment. Some threats are obvious, others are blurrier. And in some cases, and I think this is where the internet comes into play and can change the context. So just as an example, away from the internet to start with, the Supreme Court held in, I think it was 2003, that burning a cross on the lawn of an African-American family is not protected by the First Amendment. That is a threat. Even though there was nobody uttered the words, "I'm going to harm you" or "I'm going to kill you," the significance of that symbol in that context is unmistakable. And while not all examples are that extreme, other things in the context of the internet can reach the same level. So again, I actually wrote my 3L paper on this, so 20 plus years ago. There was a website, an anti-abortion website, that would collect the names and photos and addresses of abortion doctors, some of whom had already been killed. And those names were like crossed out in blood, and then others were still there. And, and there was a lawsuit over this. It was actually a very hotly contested, a very close case, but the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, in a very sharply divided decision, held ultimately that that website and that conduct was an unprotected true threat, even though the violence was not coming from the purveyor of the website. So there are contexts in which words short of "I am going to kill you" or "I'm going to harm you," combined with other circumstances, context clues, violence facilitating information, can be considered a threat. I think the third thing is that the law often has to be dragged kicking and screaming, and the people enforcing and interpreting the law often have to be dragged kicking and screaming. And this is where I think the internet comes into play. You'll hear there's a lot of oh, you stay off the internet or stay off Twitter or stay off such and such, you know, or sorry, we can't do anything about that. That's, you know, that's online, that's different. These are things that were often said and still are said to some extent about things like domestic violence, about like workplace sexual harassment. By no means have we reached full acceptance that that sort of conduct is, you know, unlawful and improper, but we've, I think, come at least a long way over the years, in part because, and unfortunately, along the way, it involved a lot of people reporting things, trying to get them to take them seriously, and, you know, and the having that play out. So I think understanding these things yourselves is an important way of sort of both understanding it, but also advocating it, and just, you know, getting people over time to understand that threats are real. The fourth thing, and we can go into more detail on this later, is that there's a wide range of conduct that isn't necessarily a threat that may or may not be protected. You know, there's no law generally against, quote, harassment or hate speech, but different types of things like defamation, you know, certain invasions of privacy, certain methods or modes of communication, and heck, copyright law, which sometimes has actually been used to take down certain forms of internet abuse. There's a number of tools, both at the state and federal level, that offer that place additional limits and can provide additional tools. And I will leave it there for now.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. I also, you know, I heard this mentioned earlier that identity, you know, factors into digital threats and harassment. You know, I'm curious for Todd and Maria. Do you give journalists different tools, or at least prepare them for varying degrees of personalized attacks, depending on their race, religion, sexual orientation, gender? And then, you know, as you're thinking about that, we know newsroom leadership continues to skew white and male. So as you're preparing and helping journalists to, you know, prepare for attacks, how do you address that? How do you give them tools in those kind of newsrooms?
Yeah, that is a great question. So we have seen overall that women, members of the LGBTQ plus community, and journalists of color face an increased risk for harassment. And we also see that certain beat and coverage areas are also high risk. And going back to my example of me being on the communities beat, I was covering several diverse groups, and I'm also someone with an intersectional identity, so that all put me at a high risk. And I would say, like in our trainings, we emphasize the point that it's not only what you cover that impacts the harassment you experience, but it's also who you are and how you look. And during our like one-on-ones or our consultations with journalists, we let them lead and allow them to tell us how their identity is impacting their work. For example, a woman journalist might come and say like, "Hey, I'm experiencing sexual harassment online." Or a Black reporter may say like, "Hey, I need a risk assessment before I go to a white supremacist rally." So in those cases, we let them lead, but sometimes it's also important for us to ask questions about identity, to understand what risks they might be facing, so that we can, you know, properly support them.
Cool. Thank you. Maria, go ahead.
I mean, I'm just gonna really build off of what Todd was saying. The way we often approach risk is there's no one size fits all when you're doing this, when you're doing a risk assessment, and we will really look at it from a really individual perspective. And I mean, here we're looking, I mean, I'm really gonna echo Todd, but we're looking at the story, at the person, and at the place, and sort of like the reporting. But there, you know, it's all going to change depending on who is involved, and depending on not only who that person sees themselves as, their identity, but also we talk about their profile, so how others may perceive them. And you may smile a little bit at this one, but if you show up wearing a New York Times um, uh, sweatshirt to you know, a political meeting, it'll be really, you could be perceived as, yeah, you're here, I'm going to talk to you, so wonderful. Or you could really, your risk profile could be the opposite. You could be making yourself more vulnerable. So we always talk not only about how you see yourself and what makes up your identity, but how you're showing up. and sort of create a threat matrix looking at that story and that person. And but we always will follow the editorial line. We will always think about who is the best person who is going to cover that story, or the best team to go cover that story, and then work off of that and look at the risk, and then look at how to mitigate that risk depending on who the people on who they are and how they will interact with their environment, again, whether it's physical or online.
That's an important point. And I also, it's sort of tangentially related, Maria, you and I talked about the fact that the New York Times acquired The Athletic nearly 3 years ago, and that provides another sort of universe almost in terms of safety and security in terms of sports fans. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that's changed your approach to digital safety for journalists?
It hasn't changed my approach to digital safety that much. I mean, I really personally, and the team very much have grown up in the same environment as PEN America, and we really are thinking in the same ways as individuals. However, the sports world is very interesting. And when I talk to folks from The Athletic, I will tell them, sports reporting can be as risky as political reporting, because there is so much passion, and there's so much unwillingness to hear different opinions, which, may seem like a goal is a goal, but the way you report a goal may not be taken the same way by a fan of a different sport. And sports fans are infamous, right, for physical hooliganism or physical, a sporting match can be dangerous, and we have encountered a variety of different risks when covering that. But online, it can also be quite vicious. And some of the most interesting cases that I've worked on have definitely involved folks who are upset about the way that a particular sporting event was covered.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch our focus now to decision making and facing real life scenarios. This is a question any of you can answer. When is it best to ignore trolls, and how do you recognize when someone has crossed the line and it warrants a response, even if that response is primarily an internal response at your news organization? And for that, I am going to bring back Tot slides, just because I think it's helpful to have that terminology back up.
Yeah, so whether you should or should not reply to trolls is definitely a personal decision. And it's also, I feel it's important to be clear about what we mean by engaging with the trolls. We do not mean to abuse the abuser or perpetuate the cycle of abuse. So at Penn, again, we recommend that you do a risk assessment before engaging with a troll. So you may choose not to engage, right? Because you may face an increase in harassment, or maybe you're being targeted by like a bot army, right? And at some point maybe there's no point at times in fighting with thousands of computers online. Or maybe you're not ready for the stress and psychological toll of confrontation. And, maybe, responding to a troll could violate your employer's social media policy or other protocols. That being said, some journalists do feel really empowered when they use counter speech, or respond to trolls, because they can, defend themselves and they can defend their work. So some reasons that folks do choose to engage is to correct a false narrative, right? To fact check false claims, or or to condemn hate and bigotry. For example, some people could, screenshot a harmful tweet and write a statement alongside the post about what makes the message so harmful. And we would say to screenshot rather than retweet, right? Because retweeting it means you're making the harmful post more popular, and you're expanding the reach of the post. So those are some things that you might want to think about on whether or not you choose to respond to a troll.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
Just a couple of thoughts. This is maybe less lawyer advice and more just sort of advice of someone who's been extremely online for a long time. I mean, I think, you know, being fairly liberal with your social media platforms, you know, block and report functions is probably a good idea. Obviously, some social media platforms are better about that than others. Parentheses, we've been seeing, I mean, I sort of about a year ago migrated away from Twitter onto Blue Sky, and after the election, we'd be seeing like a more that happening more and more, including many journalists. As well. And I think, you know, part of that is a reflection of the fact that like not only is Twitter suppressing all sorts of tweets and links to your work and whatnot, but it's also like weakened blocks so that people you block can now see you, and it's sort of weakened its moderation, whereas Blue Sky has like both a more robust moderation culture and also more advanced tools within the app to like cut down on some of this nonsense. So I think it's worth thinking about that like which platforms can you reasonably get rid of or spend your time on, and what tools are available there. I agree, and you know, and I agree with Tot that like, you know, getting into an ongoing debate with someone, you know, especially if they're behind like a, you know, a Nazi username who's, you know, threatening to kill you is probably not a good use of time, among other things. But I think, you know, blocking and reporting, I think, is important both to get this crap out of your face, but also if you're being threatened by them, you may be the only one, or you may not be, right? And the sort of, you know, multiple reports about a same person can add up and potentially lead the platform to do something about it, or not, depending on which platform it is.
Well, Greg, you actually bring up a great point that sometimes that abuse extends beyond the journalist himself. How would you handle a situation in which the harassment has extended to a journalist's family member? Is that a situation that warrants any kind of legal action?
Yeah, I mean, possibly, right? I think the more, and again, it will depend, right, exactly what it is. But I would say so a couple of factors that come into play. One, the further away you are getting from something that looks like something related to a public issue or a public debate, the less sympathy there's going to be for the person doing the stuff, and the less protection there's going to be under the First Amendment. So, you know, public debate gets a lot of leeway. There was a case in 1969, you know, 6 years after JFK was assassinated, in which someone more or less threatened to kill LBJ, but Supreme Court held at a protest, Supreme Court held that was protected because of the context. You couldn't take it seriously. You know, if that person started following LBJ's grandchildren at school, the law is going to treat that very differently. And I think the same thing with online. And yeah, following children, harassing family members, that stuff starts to amount to a threat oftentimes, even if the magic words aren't uttered, or it may violate other laws. There's, you know, anti-stalking laws in almost all states and the federal government. And again, the coverage of those laws varies, and the context will depend. But a pattern of harassment over time, especially when it's extending beyond the, you know, subject of the policy debate or theoretical policy debate, is going to be harder and harder. Is going to get less and less protection, and I think is definitely worth, you know, yeah. I would not and again, I deal with way less of this online just because I'm a straight white guy. So I will defer to people that have dealt with more of it. But I would say letting it, I guess what I will say, and you see examples of this in cases that have ended up in law enforcement with court, is ignoring it, especially if it's continuing, ignoring it usually does not make it go away. And oftentimes or not responding will oftentimes make it worse if the abusive person or the threatener sees that like you're not going to actually, you know, that they're not going to face any consequences. So obviously it'll depend on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
If I
Okay.
could jump in for a sec on that one, it's I think to the extent that it is possible to do a risk analysis ahead of a story that you think may where you see one of the risks being online harassment, I think that's really important. What we have seen is that often this behavior will ricochet off the journalist. So if the journalist has done a good job and is pretty well protected online, it could jump off to whoever is closest and easiest to target. So maybe it's a contributor to the story, or the photographer, or a family member. So knowing ahead of time how the response could be and how to protect yourself in sort of concentric circles is a really good idea. And something else, just to go back to the beginning of the question, or the first, when you began talking about it, I realize this is perhaps not feasible to everyone, but if there are editors listening, I think having the institutional voice come in and have the criticism be sort of targeting the institution rather than the individual is another good way of sort of responding to the trolls, but having the person who's on the receiving end not have to engage with the trolls. But this is more in a situation in which the person who's receiving harassment is working within an institution, which I know is not always the case.
That's a great transition, because I actually wanted to ask you, Todd, for independent journalists, what are some guidelines you give for dealing with online abusers when they might not have that institutional support of
Right.
a media company?
Right, that is a great question. So first, I would say to talk to the newsroom you are working with, if that's possible. There are also several press freedom organizations that provide support to journalists and freelancers. For example, there's us, PEN America, there's IWMF, CPJ, there's Aegis Safety Alliance. There's also a Culture of Safety, also known as ACOS. They work a lot with freelancers. I would also recommend for folks who are freelancers to reach out to our Journalist Safety Urgent Care Helpline. So this provides US-based journalists and news outlets at risk for their work with one-on-one and small group safety consults for digital, physical, legal, and psychosocial concerns. So that is also another resource for folks, and that will be running until through the inauguration. And this, the helpline is a collaboration between the Night Election Hub, PEN America, and several leading safety experts and 5 different press freedom organizations.
Another organization I just want to mention, I've worked with them for a while on as the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They do a lot of different things, and their website's actually great. I mean, honestly, even when I'm like, oh, I need to look up the nuts and bolts of the Freedom of Information law in state X, oftentimes one could do worse than just going up on their page and starting there. But they also have like a legal hotline, and they have various resources and work with, and have sort of networks of pro bono lawyers. They focus on a lot of news gathering issues, so they're not obviously dealing only with threats, but as new threats and harassment are now part of the often part of the news gathering environment. So Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press is a good resource, both for these issues and many other issues as well.
Great resources. And Todd, you mentioned ACOS. Maria, if I'm not mistaken, you're affiliated with ACOS. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that organization?
You're not mistaken. I'm currently the president of the board of ACOS. ACOS is actually, it's an alliance. It's that brings together freelance journalists, freedom of expression organizations like PEN America, and newsrooms to work together to change the culture of safety in the newsroom. ACOS was founded after oh gosh, I'm gonna get the date wrong, but it's 2014, after the 2014 killings of freelancers in Syria, where it became evident that freelancers did not have the same safety support that staffers did have. So ACOS has developed a myriad, truthfully, resources, both for freelance journalists, independent journalists, but for newsrooms. So if you're a small newsroom, I really encourage to check out these resources. We have some really cool things that are sort of like health checks that will allow you to check to see where you are. It's not critical. It's not, it's just sort of like a point by point of how to work in some safety resources into your newsroom. Same goes for journalists, like really use the resources that are there. ACOS also does safety clinics, so please feel free to use those as well.
One other point I wanted to make, I guess the first point I wanted to make is sort of just reiterate, like I'm just looking in the chat, seeing a question about someone facing security issues. obviously law enforcement can be more or less helpful depending on where they are, who it is, what the circumstances are. So I certainly, on the one hand, don't want to say that calling the police is always the best idea or is going to fix things. Sometimes it might, sometimes it won't. That said, I do think if don't like, if your common sense tells you that this is an actual danger, I do think, one should not be shy about contacting law enforcement. And if they don't do anything about it, to then continue to press them. I mean, there was examples. This was not a journalism example, but this was a sort of notorious cyberbullying instance in which the person called, I think it was in Florida, the person called police blew her off. She eventually contacted her senator, who actually got the police involved or whatever. And so obviously you have to evaluate, the circumstances, but I think if you feel like you're in danger, again, I think don't let the I'm a journalist or this is online get in the way of just how you might respond to this if you weren't a journalist or you were just dealing with this in person. Is the first thing. The second thing is there are steps, and as journalists, you have skills in this regard. There are steps that you can take, not only just reporting on social media, that can crack down on this. So there was a story in the Texas Observer the other day in which there was a couple of basically an expose on the operators behind. There were 4 sort of notorious neo-Nazi accounts on Twitter that were getting a much freer hand under Twitter's new management. And Texas Observer did a big story and identified them. And you'd be surprised. One of the people was I forget which, had a fancy financial job basically, which they then lost once their boss was once their supervisors were like, oh, you're running a Nazi account on Twitter, right? So there are obviously, not everyone has the resources to do a full investigative story, and some people are easier to identify than others, but there are still for many of the people behind this, there can be real social consequences, even if what they're doing. And the Nazi speech is protected. General Nazi speech is fully protected under the First Amendment without more. Yet there are still ways to hold people accountable using, for instance, tools available to you as journalists.
I want to, you brought up law enforcement, Greg, and I'm glad you did, because actually, Todd and Maria, I do want to ask if you, when it comes to reaching out to law enforcement, do you have any thoughts on that, advice? When is it sort of the right choice? Is it depend on the situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that you are the best person to assess whether online abuse has made you feel unsafe or fear for your safety, especially when it comes to physical safety. But I would pair up with a friend to ask yourself some questions like, has your harasser made an explicit threat that names you specifically or includes very specific details? For example, saying I hate tot is very different than I will hit tot at Whole Foods. That's completely different. And I would also add that, the police are able to respond when a crime has been committed. So they might be better positioned to respond when you've been, named in direct threats of violence that suggest a time, a place, or location, or if your online abuser has published non-consensual sexually explicit images of you. Maybe you're being stalked via electronic communication, or the identity of your online harasser and you want to seek a restraining order. So that is what comes to mind for me.
Thank you.
The other thing I would say is knowing, there are often sort of responses you can expect or might expect to get when reporting some of these things, and being able to, again, it's not going to work every time, but it's, I think, important and sometimes will. I'm just thinking even back, again, this was not a journalist, but just a friend of mine a couple of years ago who was getting harassed by her ex, right? And it was escalating to the point that it became concerning and it was starting to actually be illegal. And she was able to get in touch with a lawyer at a law school clinic who advised her, okay, at this point, call the police. And the lawyer even told the person, all right, when you call the police, they're probably going to say, we can't do anything about this because blah, blah, blah. And you should say in response, blah, blah, blah. It's exactly what happened. She responded, the police came, and, the guy got arrested. She eventually decided to drop the charges. And I think this guy did learn his lesson after a night in jail. But, the and it can often be very simple, right? Like just basic things like the threats law applies fully to the internet, or, if federal law prohibits interstate threats, there doesn't have to be a national security component, right? There doesn't have to be magic words. Things like that are, because, and I see this as a criminal defense lawyer. I was sort of joking last week when we were preparing that, a lot of the time, stuff that helps me represent my clients as a criminal defense lawyer makes me horrified as a taxpayer. But you're not necessarily dealing with like super sophisticated legal actors here. And if you're getting a like, sorry, we can't do anything about the internet. No, I read the law. It applies, it applies to the internet as well. There are court cases or whatever, things like that. It may or may not work, but like it's that kind of drumbeat that I think is important.
Yeah, and there's certainly resources into that. And I want to keep an eye on the time here and get to our audience questions. So I would like to give each of you a chance to talk about prevention, preparing. As we all know, the best way to solve a problem is to address it before it becomes one. So first, Maria, if I could go to you, if you could offer 2 to 3 tips for how journalists can protect themselves before harassment happens. We'll start with you, and then Todd, I'll go to you in your slides.
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing, to go back to my idea of how are you how are you inhabiting that online space? And I just want to echo a lot of what we've said before. I can be prescriptive. I'm not going to tell you what you can or cannot put online, because that's really a personal decision. And there are folks who really need some information to be up there because it's part of their brand. But it's really important to know what information is out there, so that if it resurfaces, okay, that information about my sister was on that website, or, whatever it is, because knowledge is power. But also understanding what you're putting out about you on the internet will give you that power. So understanding, doing routine audits of what's out there on old social media outlets that you may not be using, what's out there on your Venmo, is it private? What's out there on your wedding registry? Is that still up? Just know what is out there and know what can be used against you. And also know, if you can, or to take the time to look into how the space that you're reporting in, how it interacts online. I'm trying to be as direct as I can, but if you're reporting on someone who has a history of being adversarial online, what are their methods? And prepare for those. Just take a moment to think about it, and take a moment also to talk about it with your team, with your editor, as well as with your family. And I think the last thing, I'm not sure if it's so much preparation, as I want to echo something that's been said a lot, and is trust your spidey sense. If something feels off, something likely is off. Don't think, oh, I'm not being doxxed, so this doesn't merit me escalating or seeking help. If something does not feel right, please seek help. There are a lot of resources. Talk to a friend, talk to your editor, talk to whoever you need to talk to, and sort of bounce that off and look at where you need to go, but don't let it sit. Trust your gut.
I'm definitely a big proponent of trusting your gut. I'm glad you said that. Thank you, Todd. Why don't we go to you, and I'll bring up your slides again. I know you have some tips here.
Yeah, so first I would recommend for folks to practice password hygiene. So use long, complex passwords that are 16 plus characters and unique to each of your accounts. And because you'll, have, these different passwords for each of your accounts, you might be thinking like, oh, how can I remember all of those passwords? The best bet is for you to use a password manager to save this information. And I would also say for you to enable two-factor authentication on as many devices as possible. So 2FA requires you to provide a PIN to prove that you are the individual logging into your account. So you can use an authenticator app that, generates a code for you, and you must use that code before it expires. There are 3 ways to do, 2FA. I won't go into every single way, but no matter what method you use, make sure that you save your backup codes. Save your backup codes somewhere safe, just in case you lose your device or if it's stolen. And again, I'm happy, to discuss more about other ways, other methods of 2FA after the panel.
Wonderful. And I could definitely back you up on saving those backup codes because I have
Yeah.
lost
Yeah.
mine
Yeah.
with Saint
Yeah.
Phone.
But
Mhm.
by the way, and I don't know as much about Android or Windows, but Apple has now pretty extensive built-in password management
Mhm.
features in both iOS and macOS, and you can do including like two-factor authentication built right in, and so it's definitely the simplest way. And by the way, I've been doing all these things for years, and I'm not doing it I'm not doing it primarily. I'm guarding not against threats, but just against like, hackers, people who want to steal my credit card information, or like the government. And obviously reporters have to be pretty locked down because there's and going to be probably more of this, going to be increasing efforts to um, get at reporters information, correspondence with sources, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are um, the full range of, password protection, encryption, things like that are multi-purpose tools, both, personally, professionally, and as against the government. By the way, one other thing, I think, like, end-to-end encryption for communications, right, especially for messaging, is important. And one sort of thing that I think a lot of people don't think about, and I think about this, especially when doing criminal defense stuff, is like for a lot of people on the Apple side, the weak link is your backups, because iMessage is end-to-end encrypted, right? Apple can't give the law enforcement a key to that, even if they want to. But by default, iCloud backups, which most people I think probably turn on to back up your phone and your photos and all that, are not end-to-end encrypted. And so you will often see in a criminal defense case, a big multi-thousand page digest of your client's like entire internet history, which law enforcement got from iCloud,
Yeah.
from Apple because of an iCloud backup. And there is an option called advanced data protection through Apple that you can turn on that will end-to-end encrypt your backups as well. Again, that's probably more of an issue with the government, with government subpoenas. Like, I think some random 4chan troll is not going to hack into Apple's servers, but I think thinking about like just where are your pots of data stored, and is there a weak link in that chain, is good to think about, because like the iCloud backups are something that most people have probably, and there's everything on your phone is there, and you may think you have everything encrypted, and then there's this big like giant opening that so think about things like that.
That's really helpful, especially as all this technology is changing so rapidly. I want to turn now. First of all, thank you all. I want to turn to our questions from the audience. We have some really great ones, and just so you all know, I brought up some of the resources that Todd shared from Pen America. So in case you want to reach out, there's also a QR code that you can scan for some of this digital safety programs. So I want to start with a question from our audience. How should American or US-based journalists handle threats made online by people from outside the US, and particularly in countries with poor rule of law and an adversarial relationship with the US? Is it worth pursuing legal remedies in such cases?
Um, maybe not. I mean, I think uh, by the way, we haven't talked about this, but there's always a question of, do you know who it is? Because, sometimes the sources of the threat are identified and sometimes they're not. And so a lot of the time, there are ways to unmask people technologically or legally. There's a thing called John Doe suits, where you literally sue a John Doe, and then once the lawsuit is in place, you subpoena John Doe's, you subpoena Twitter or Facebook or John Doe's internet service provider, or kind of whatever, and work backwards. And then there's various legal fights that arise, and but there, I mean, I think a person, and I think it also depends, like, would you have a way to collect a judgment against a person? It sounds like in the hypothetical, you probably wouldn't. So I think there you're thinking about, you know, responses short of a U.S. legal judgment, whether it's, whether that's, social media moderators, whether that's employment based, whether that's exposure based, whether, things like that. If they're overseas and they're like firmly overseas, on the one hand, I think the threat of violence from that person is fairly low. Uh, and then it's a question of like, are they inciting a mob against you in ways that are not protected? And then are you trying to get at their downstream people? Even if they're abroad, they're probably using US infrastructure in some regard. And so there are potential hooks. But I think, you're thinking about, if you get a judgment at the end of the day against this person, perhaps in absentia, is it going to be useful to you? Maybe, maybe not. But I think you want to be thinking about like, what are like the steps along the way that's enabling that person to do that?
Absolutely. Similarly, there's a question about international journalism for Maria. Someone asked, I would like to ask Maria about women journalists working in Asian countries like Bangladesh that are easily being targeted by political parties or different groups of people with their religious beliefs. We are working, taking risks, staying vulnerable with these abusive attacks mentally. Are you talking about psychological, and what are ways we can protect ourselves and continue working? So I think the question is about protecting yourself mentally, psychologically in an intense environment like that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. Well, I think you've done some of the work, and it's trying to understand what the risk is. I think there are many ways that you can implement psychological safety support. One is to use your network of peers and have have a space where you can be talking to each other, supporting each other, just generally being there. There are also resources online. I would say, again, many of the places that Todd has been sharing have additional resources for more specific things that you can be doing, that you can be implementing to have more space, to have more support, and to seek some additional help. There are organizations that connect you to therapists who are working there, or that can help you put together a peer support network. But the most important thing is, I think, creating the space, acknowledging that this is impacting you and that you need some support from folks who are around you, who understand the space that you're in, and who may be able to just the ability to talk to people about that will make a really big difference. I will say one thing, and is, in creating that space, try to really create it within your professional realm if it's possible, because this remains a part of your job. It isn't, an additional thing that you're doing to be well. It is part of your job, and it's important to have that be something that you're sharing with other folks that you have a professional relationship with.
Thank you. Now you mentioned some of the places that our data or personal information lives, like Venmo, sort of a one you might not think of in this case, but can you give us some more examples like that so that we can do our personal info audits? That's another question, another great question from our audience.
I think I'm gonna have Todd hop on here too and help me out with this one.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, Venmo.
LinkedIn is something, people usually have a lot of personal information on LinkedIn. Sometimes I also see folks are not aware that a resume or some form of PDF has all of their information online, and they completely forgot about this specific PDF. But I would definitely say LinkedIn, Facebook, X, those are
Your
some of the
exercising apps, whatever you
Mhm.
use to track your run or to share your run, or I think Strava, is that one? I'm not a terrible
I'm
with.
not the right person to ask.
Yeah, no, me neither. I mean, this is not my thing, but there are a bunch of apps where you're sharing things about how you exercise. Those are super vulnerable because you're also sharing sort of the routes you run in. And it's very simple. Just an audit look at what you use on a regular basis and see what the privacy settings are set to and set them to as private as can be.
Yeah, I mean,
would- yeah.
even thinking just like, and I don't particularly, and again, like Apple Music, which is the streaming service I use, you know, there's a thing where you can follow people and see what they're listening to and vice versa. You know, it's a thing you can turn on or off. Venmo is a big one. I mean, I have a doctor who would accept payment by Venmo, and I was trying to get her to use just like the Apple Pay Cash, where you can like iMessage money to someone. I was trying to get her to use it because it's easier. But then there was a story, it was early in the Biden administration, about how someone was basically able to identify Joe Biden's like Joe Biden on Venmo based on sort of lax privacy settings. And I sent that to her, and she was like, "Oh, thank you for sending this," and then like promptly started accepting like Apple Cash, things like that. The one thing I do want to say, and this is not a really a lawyer point either, and there is, I think, like, and a lot of this is like, it's important to like do what you can to protect yourself and to make life easier for yourself. Yes, yes, and yes. I think there is also the risk that people who want to either avoid responsibility for dealing with your threats or blow you off, or be like, well, why didn't you do this, or why didn't you do this, or what did you think was going to happen if you went on Twitter, or what? And it's like, ultimately, there are things you can do that may work or that may not. The biggest determination, I think, of why I don't get very many threats online, or if any, is, like I said, well, I'm not famous, but also I'm a straight white guy. Like, is nothing to do with my infosec, right? It's just like, and if I weren't, I would get way more, right? And so the related thing is, as a journalist, you need some of your information out there, right? I mean, I just happen to be following her. There's a reporter, Sarah Jung. She works for The Verge, but she happened to be in Korea when the coup happened, right? I think she was on vacation. So all of a sudden she started live posting on Blue Sky, and it was great. I mean, it was just like, she said she like expensed her cab ride or something like that, right? But she, in her bio, is like, it has an email where you can reach her with tips. And I think she even says in her bio, like, thoughts, tips, or death threats at, Sarah Jung, whatever. But like, taking down all of your contact information makes it hard to do your job as a reporter, right? And so, and et cetera, doing appearances, telling people, hey, I'm going to be on this panel at this place on this day to talk about all these things are like professionally important. So I think it's important both to remember that ultimately this should not be your individual responsibility to solve. Obviously, you should take the steps that will, make it harder on the margins, but ultimately, in the same way that you can't fend off various forms of assault by dressing in the right way, like, at the end of the day, some of this transcends individual responsibility. And I think you should not expect yourself to like ruin or harm your career or make your career harder, in the hopes that it will, make it harder for harassers. I realize this is not like, there's not an easy answer there, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind that if you go too far with this, it is my individual responsibility, you end up shooting your career in the foot, which is like ultimately kind of what the harasser wants. So
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Maria, I think you had something to share. I'm gonna let you have the last word here.
Oh my God, that is big responsibility. I think the last word is ultimately, it is, again, to echo what I've been saying, it is an individual, there's no one size fits all. So you have to think about like who you are, what your risk tolerance is, what you're reporting on, and make an assessment. And the assessment may shift depending on changes to your career, may shift depending on the story you're working on, may shift on personal changes. But just be thinking about risk and make that a part of your news gathering work. Just think about how it changes and keep it going. It's not a one thing, and it's not going to be you did a risk assessment once, you're good to go. Just keep it going.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end it. To our panelists, if you are okay with people, reaching out to you with questions, please share your info in the chat. It's okay if not. I just want to thank you all for your time this morning. I think it was a great session. If you have time to fill out our survey, that's also in the chat. We'd love to know how we did. If there are suggestions for future trainings. That's what we want to know. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great weekend. Hope you all learned a lot. I know I sure did. Take care, everyone.